So I do these little astronomy updates every chance I get before the speaker. So we're going to hit 3 quick topics here. Start with our second interstellar visitor. This is Comet Borissov, 2I Borissov. The 2I means the second interstellar object. It was called Comets 2019 Q4 Borissov, and then they went, hey, look at that orbit. That thing is not sticking around. It's come from far away and is moving very quickly. This was discovered by astronomer Gennady Borisov. Anybody have any idea if I said that right? I don't know. August 30th of this year. It's a hyperbolic orbit. It's probably just under a mile to maybe as large as 4 miles in size and diameter. It's again second known object after Oumuamua. Came by in 2017. That was more of a spindly shaped asteroid-like body. And the findings are that chemically it is indistinguishable from comets that come from our own solar system and come sailing through. Here's the discover. I think this is the scope he was using to discover it. It's very, very dim. This thing, there are so many large-scale surveys out there, so many automatic robotic computers scanning the sky for things moving that the day of the private individual finding some dim comet and getting a name on it are closing rapidly. And so good for this guy to pull it off. He is down here in the Crimean Peninsula off of Ukraine. That's where his observatory is. So lots of dark skies around that site. I think that's sort of a wildlife refuge area in that part. So that's where he's doing his observations. Come on. Here's the first spectra of the comet. There's a picture of it. And D-type class, Comet Shoemaker is a D-type class comet, and you can see they're very, very similar. So that's kind of interesting. It came from some other star system, and it's almost the same as ours. Here's a 2-color composite image of the comet from the Gemini North Telescope, and then here's a Hubble image from October 12th. So very dim. It's coming down from above.
John, you got a question?
Yes, question.
Now I see why you think it's interstellar, because it comes from so high.
Yeah, it comes from so high, and its velocity is so great that it will not stay around it. The sun's gravity is not enough to hold it. Yeah.
Do we know what the velocity is? Is it on one of the slides?
I don't think I put the velocity down. I figured that might put me into the nerd category. So. Yeah, I didn't put that down. Sorry about that.
Fast.
Fast, yeah. Astonishingly fast.
They have some clue as to where it's coming from?
Yeah, I don't have that information. I think it was at Cancer, or something near constellation Cancer. Well, it's just coming in. Jill, if you would hit it, my lovely assistant Jill is going to hit the play button. You get to see where the comet's going through the sky from October on into next year. So it's sailing in from the north. It's closest to the sun on December 8th, and it's closest to Earth on December 30th. So it's probably going to be brightest in early December, and it's already plunging quickly into the southern sky where we can't see it anymore. And so there it is starting to, it seems to make a loop. That's because the Earth is going around the sun, so it gives it a little curve in its apparent position as it sails away. That's April 2020. That's where we end. So if you're going to catch it before the moon really starts to interfere a lot, it's going to be in the early morning sky in early December. It's going to be the best, somewhere around the 8th or 12th. I'm going to try to observe it, but at its brightest, it may only make it up to about 16th magnitude, which is, yes, that's you got to have something in the 8 to 10 inch range minimum, dark location, better to have 11, 12 inches or more of aperture on your telescope. So unless this surprises us, this is going to be barely reachable by the backyard observer. So that guy has got quite a toy that he's playing with.
So this one has quite a bit of ice on it, and if you can see it even, because it is not a lot of carbon.
Oh, yeah, okay. My next mini topic here is there's a transit of Mercury. Anybody tell me what a transit of Mercury is? What is it?
It's the planet going between us and the sun.
You got it. Because of the slight tilt of the relative orbits of the Earth and Mercury and Venus, we only get special times when the planet goes right across the face of the sun. This is going to be November 11th. This is one day before Disney Plus goes live, so it'll be in transit as the sunrise occurs. At sunrise that morning, it'll be 6:42 a.m. here. The next one's going to be November 2032, so you might want to do that. If you're going to observe it, you want to have a telescope with a proper solar filter firmly affixed to the front, blocking 99.9999% of the light before it gets into the telescope. You don't want all that sunlight being concentrated and heating up parts and heating up some filter down at the bottom and burning out your eye and burning out your camera if something cracks or goes out of alignment. You want to stop it up front with a good firm cap in that fashion. Here's the disk of the sun. When the sun rises for berthed Longmont area, this planet will be about that location with that much distance to travel, and it's just about going right across the center of the sun. So there's the middle of the sun right there, and that little plus sign. So pretty fun.
So,
and finally, yes, question?
John, it's basically watching grass grow, right?
It's very slow. These are hours. So
3
there's
hours.
1 hour, there's another hour, there's another hour.
See a little
So-
dot going from the sun. See the little dot.
To see a tiny little dot. Yeah, if there's a lot of smoke and moisture in the air and there's a large sunspot, sometimes people will glimpse the sun and see a sunspot. Even Chinese astronomers way back saw sunspots. I believe that the angular size of this dot is below the resolution of the human eye. So you're not going to glimpse it. So don't look at the sun ever. So
Is this about the same size as Venus transit?
it's smaller. Yeah.
Well,
So
Venus is further away from the sun. So
it's closer to us, so it's bigger and closer to us. Yes.
Will it show up on Soho's images?
I don't think so, because Soho's got its own orbital location. Oh, is that a good question? I'll look that up. I'll see if, so maybe it'll be offset from this path, but I'll look, I'll see. All right, and finally, you may have heard in the news that Saturn now is the moon winner in the solar system. Carnegie Institute for Science, led by Scott Shepard, discovered a whole new batch, 20 new moons that need names, by the way. 17 belong to what they call the Norse group, and the furthest moon from Saturn now is one of these. They may be collision fragments, only about 5 kilometers or so in size. That takes Saturn up to a total of 82 moons, beating out Jupiter at 79. So it's just like a Broncos game. I'm sorry, it hurts. Okay, so they don't have names for all these moons, so they have a contest starting October 7th, running through December 6th. You tweet your suggested moon name to @SaturnLunacy, and I'll tell you why you picked it. You can also send in photo artworks and videos. Use the hashtag name Saturn moons to stand out. So here's the orbits of these. Most of these are retrograde, they go in the wrong direction from everything else. Some aren't. So it's got a little more crowded, to our knowledge, around Saturn. Nothing new happened out there. It's just we really stared at it and worked at it. I believe this team is going to go back to Jupiter, use the same techniques, and look for more. So Jupiter may win again in the future. So, all right.
So the answer to your question on the Soho thing is yes.
Oh, it will be.
Soho is L1 between the Earth and the Sun.
Excellent.
Yes, it will be.
Okay, so you got it. Yes.
John, on that last picture, the green is going the opposite direction around the racetrack.
Yes.
You guys?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that makes it exciting.
It sure does.
John,
Yes.
where is Titan in this whole picture?
Titan's distance would probably be similar to that. I think
Okay.
it's right in that type of orbit. Yeah.
Why don't they hit each other?
Hmm?
Why don't they collide?
They got their own orbits.
Get more moves.
Yeah.
Smaller.
All right.
Yeah, it used to be 3 big ones.
That's no moon. All right, so we're going to switch gears now, and Mike is going to introduce Robert.
I'm not sure if Robert needs any introduction. We can give him some while you guys are changing microphones. So Robert used to live in Fort Collins and studied at CSU mathematics. He was a wizard at mathematics. Got his PhD in lossless compression techniques. Right? Basically.
Close enough, yeah.
And currently works in Colorado Springs, so he made the arduous trek from Colorado Springs. He left, I think, today at 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock,
Yeah.
and made it worth it by 5:30. So it was a long journey. Robert has done this talk once or twice here already, I think, and he has updated some images. Hopefully you have some cool stories to tell how you do things. I think there's a lot of interest in how you do things, and what the gizmo is behind us, and what kind of gear you're using. And with that, Robert.
Should a kid come in
These are
here? Thank you. Well,
Cool.
there's 2 upstairs. Yes.
your boundaries.
Okay. So okay. So thank you for having me here. Where am I at? Door. Okay. I'm told I'm restricted to a certain area up here. So okay. So tonight I'm going to be talking about nightscape photography. So lots of different types of astrophotography out there, just like there are a lot of different types of daytime photography. You can do work in studios, you can do landscape, macro. Similarly, astrophotography has lots of different flavors as well. One of the most common types of astrophotography is deep sky astrophotography, like the nice pictures that we have by Scott over here on your left. This requires, big mounts, telescopes, hours and hours of exposures pointing the same things, and finally processing a huge stack of images down into one. This is the way I got started in astrophotography. This is the way I think most people get started doing astrophotography, taking pictures of very small, faint, fuzzy objects in the night sky. This is a fairly difficult process to do. A lot of aligning, a lot of heavy equipment, a lot of gear, a lot of processing, a lot of techniques go into creating an image like that. But I found that it was a little bit too complicated. I want something a little bit easier. So, even though I started out imaging deep sky images, I started out with a big 20-inch telescope and guider, very similar to the setup that Little Thompson Observatory has up here. I started to gradually pare back and got a smaller scope, a smaller mount, trying to get more images, get better quality images with smaller gear. And finally, I wound up with something that looks like this, a standard DSLR and camera lens. No telescope, no mount, no nothing. Basically just this and a still tripod. And that's where we'll begin tonight. So what is nightscape imaging? How does it differ from these images that we see over here of the horse head of the Andromeda Galaxy, of all the faint fuzzies? Well, nightscape imaging combines the landscape and the night sky. Lots of different examples of this, but really the best way to start out is just with a wide-angle lens and a digital camera, a common stock camera. So lots of different forms this can take. This is the moon rising over Denver from one of the nearby mountains. man-made ice castle that was built here in Colorado. Basically, I was shooting up through this ice castle and with a fairly wide-angle lens. This was about a 200-millimeter camera lens to capture the Andromeda Galaxy right in the center of the hole in the ice castle. A couple more examples from Glacier National Monument, or Park, thank you. Showcasing the Milky Way on the left and just a Milky Way-less starry sky on the right. So this is what the talk tonight is going to be about. How do we create nightscape images? First of all, we have to ask our question, why do we need a big camera equipment like this? Why do we need a huge lens, a DSLR? In the programmer sheet here, I recommend either a DSLR or mirrorless. But why have all this equipment when we have our phones always in our pockets with the camera? Apple, Samsung, whatever, always says this is the best camera. You always get great images out of these devices. And, for the most part, that is true. This was a nighttime, or not a nighttime image. This was a sunset image taken with my smartphone. Great color, a lot of contrast. The sky is good. You can see detail in the landscape. I took the same exact shot with a big, expensive DSLR and wide-angle lens just a few moments later. And the results are not impressive. You lose a little bit of the detail is gone. The colors are all over everywhere. So why can't we, do any type of nightscape photography with our smartphones? And that's because, essentially the magic lies in the processing. Smartphones have very small camera sensors. They have very small lenses. And you can't escape physics. For nighttime imaging, for any type of imaging, low light situations, we're wanting to collect as many photons as possible. We can't do that with a very small sensor, with a very small lens. But where our smartphones succeed is in camera processing. This is taking, this is basically the algorithms that Apple and all these other phone companies have made that will really boost your images, give you great daytime images. At night, though, this is basically the difference. On the left is an image taken with my smartphone. On the right is an image taken with my DSLR. With a smartphone, with any type of small image camera sensor, you're not going to get a lot of light. You're not going to get hardly anything in there. I think you can see a single star within the image taken with a smartphone. And this is one of the reasons for this is you can't adjust any of the settings. You can't, adjust how long your exposure is. You can't adjust the noise or the ISO. You can't adjust the F ratio. It's all set in camera. Whereas with the DSLR or mirrorless, as technology has progressed, you can change all these settings. And that is how we're going to proceed going from here. We're going to always assume that we're going to be using the DSLR or mirrorless. And for the sake of me speaking, I'm just going to keep saying DSLR. Mirrorless is thrown in there, but not going to keep saying both. So one of the hardest things, yes?
Well, what is mirrorless?
Mirrorless is basically the evolution of the DSLR. But whereas the DSLR has a shutter inside that when you press a button, the mirror will slap open and expose the sensor. And then once the exposure is done, the shutter will slap back down, allowing you to basically look through the eyepiece or look through the viewfinder. A mirrorless is just an evolution of this where it doesn't have that mirror slap in the middle. So a lot of mirrorless cameras are a lot smaller, a lot more compact. They use typically a different lens mount, and they've made the lenses a lot smaller. Mirrorless is sort of the next evolution of DSLRs, although some debate that, but a lot easier to carry around. You're not carrying a 5-10 pound piece of equipment. You can get the similar shots with a nice tube.
You still do the eyepiece?
No eyepiece actually, so it is all screen. So it's basically you have a continuous live view.
Some do have an electronic viewfinder.
Electronic viewfinder. Okay, yeah.
So it looks like the same kind of looking through the eyepiece, but it's an electronic.
Yeah, okay. Because you don't have to bother with that film stuff in there anymore, so why not change it all?
So yeah, and like I said, so for tonight, just assume that mirrorless is included when I'd say DSLR. But the first thing that we need to learn how to do, and the hardest thing to learn how to do in order to get started, is to focus. Because when you're out, most of the time, when you get started, autofocus doesn't work. This is, I was leading a small workshop, and this is the image of one of my students on that workshop. This was basically the result of the autofocused image. This was taken in Arches National Park, out the camera again, Arches National Park, I think, yes. And trying to get focused just by looking through the viewfinder and hitting the button to autofocus, this is the result. Our cameras are very, very stupid, especially at night. A lot of the features that you're accustomed to on cameras that work in the daytime, autofocusing, any type of metering or evaluation of the images by the camera, fail at night. So a lot of what we have to do is all manual when we're doing Nightscape images. Even when we think we're close though, looking at this full image, it looks like our stars are fairly pinpoint, which is what we're wanting. However, if we zoom in, we can see that our stars are not pinpoint, and this will become really apparent if you're trying to actually do anything with this image, processing the image. We want these stars, when blown up to maximum magnification, to be as small as possible. So that's why focusing is one of the hardest things and one of the first things that we need to learn how to do, because even looking at a full image like this, it can look like our image is in focus until we actually get out of the field and back to our computers where we can blow things up. So why is this hard? Well, the easiest way to do Nightscape or to focus is to use live view mode. And when you're using live view mode at night, this is likely going to be what you're going to see through live view mode. Now we have the advantage here. This image is, let's say, 8 feet across, maybe, on this projector here. When you're trying to focus, you're likely looking at a 2 to 3 inch screen. And you can't see anything. This shot here, there's a beautiful canyon in front of me. The Milky Way was full and bright up above. And still, if you look really closely, all you can see is 2 pinpoint dots. And pretty much that is all you're ever going to be able to see in live view mode. Live view mode, it operates by taking one image after another, after another, after another really quickly. On my camera, it's limited to basically the equivalent of 1/30th of a second to get 30 frames, produce an image that's 30 frames a second. And you're only going to be able to see some of the brightest stars in the night sky. When we blow this up to 10 times magnification here, we can see that this brightest object is the 16th brightest star in the night sky, or Spica. So even though that we can see with our human eyes a full sky, a Milky Way of stars, of everything else, our cameras cannot. Our cameras do not have the same sensitivity as our eyes when it comes to at least a live view mode, doing it at 1/30th of a second. So only the top 20, 30, 40 stars in the night sky will ever be visible to focus with. And the process for focusing is the same as I described before. We're wanting to get this star as small as possible. And with live view, we can do that in real time, but just by changing the focus ring on our lens. Another easier way to focus, depending on your situation here, here's another example. Can anyone tell me what that is? Yep, it is the moon. With a wide angle lens, we are, Nightscape photography is all about combining the landscape with the night sky, which means we're shooting with a wide angle lens. And despite what you may see on, Pinterest or Instagram, where the photographers blow up the moon to half the size of the frame, when you're shooting a wide angle, it's not that big. So this particular shot here was a 24mm camera lens, and the moon, if you look at the full image here, the moon is basically overexposed, and it's a very, very, very small fraction of this image. But we can use the moon to focus on as well. So with live view mode and the moon is out, we can basically zoom in on our live view and get basically this box here is the 10 times magnification of the live view. And we can start to see little craters, some of the largest craters and some of the largest mara on the moon. This is an excellent way to focus if you're shooting with moonlight. And basically, instead of trying to get the moon as small as possible, the goal here is to get the largest craters as sharp as possible. That will also give you a nice focus to start with. So, where do we go from here? If we know how to focus, let's start out with as simple as possible. And basically, the way that this talk will progress is we're going to keep adding new elements to our imaging. So we'll start out with just a DSLR and a camera lens on a still tripod, and we'll slowly add more and more equipment as we go along. So, before beginning, some of you may have seen this before. This is a very common photographer's tool called the exposure triangle. Basically, there are 3 settings that we have to worry about when we're dealing with a DSLR. And those settings are the shutter speed, how long you're taking, or how long you're exposing the image for. There's aperture, which is essentially how open the lens is. The lens itself will have a shutter on it, and you can change how much light is entering through that the blades there. And there's the ISO, which is essentially the gain of the camera. This will affect the amount of noise in the image. Now, why did I bring this tool up? Well, there's a trade-off for just general photography. As your ISO increases, your image gets brighter but noisier. As your shutter exposure increases, you collect more photons, but your subject may be blurry. As you open your lens up more, you get a bigger aperture but more vignetting. But for nighttime images, it's a little bit different. We're not taking the nice, easy shots that we take during landscape photography. We're not taking the fraction of a second shots. We're not stopping down our lens in order to get the absolute sharpness, because we are limited by the number of photons. We're limited by light. As we go out there and shoot at night, most of the time it is very dark. It is very difficult to collect photons. So, a couple other properties fall into play, not only because of how much light we don't have to work with, but also because we're imaging pinpoint sources of light. For all intents and purposes, stars are pinpoint sources of light. A little bit of fuzziness happens in the atmosphere, but we'll ignore that for this discussion here. So we get a couple other effects. Let's take a look at what happens about the ISO. So this is a nighttime shot. Basically 2 shots. One is 10 seconds with my ISO at the maximum value it will be on can be on my camera, and one is basically the equivalent shot at a much lower ISO. So in terms of brightness, these 2 images are identical. Once again, using the exposure triangle, as you increase one, you decrease another. Same type of thing here. Only when I'm shooting at very high ISO, high ISO at night, we see a lot of noise cropping up in the image. Whereas if we're using a much lower ISO, not nearly as much noise. Same thing for the night sky. You know, we can when we're using a 10-second shot, we can see nice pinpoint stars. But when we increase it to 160 seconds, we get star trails in order to compensate. So how do we balance the noise versus exposure length? We also have to balance the F ratio. How open is your lens? So, like I said, a little bit different here at night when we're shooting night and pinpoint sources of light. When we're shooting pinpoint sources of light, we have to worry about what's called chromatic aberration. So basically, as the brightest stars, the brightest pinpoint sources of light we're talking about, if you open up your lens too much, you'll get these horrible blue-purple tinges around them. Basically, the light is diffusing out in a way that you do not like. We also have to worry about vignetting. Basically, the corners and edges of the image are going to be darker than the center of the image. And when we're producing an image, you know, uniform background, uniform light intensity is good. So I am going to flip between two images. This one is with the lens wide open at f2. This is the image, same image taken with an f5.6. So basically I stop down the lens 2 steps to try and balance out what happens when we're talking about night. And if we look, we can see that the stars in the center doesn't have nearly the blue-purple background, tinging background. We see that the vignetting is a lot better, and we're getting a lot better stars, especially in the corners, compared to this. So, 3 settings, and that's all we're balancing out when we're doing nightscape photography. Shutter speed, noise, ISO, and F ratio. And yes.
Just this point of curiosity, these 2 examples. What's the focal length of the lens you're using on this?
24 millimeters. So we're talking wide angle lens here.
So a fair amount of distortion is going to happen with the edges anyway, but exaggerated
Yes.
with the f-stop we have for the aperture.
Correct, yes. And then actually for both of these images here, I did do a lens profile correction. Just doing that with Lightroom, so some the built-in known distortion has already been removed from these images. Yes?
The speckles in the background, are they noise or are they stars?
Yes, all of this in through here, this is noise. So in order to do to get basically the equivalent brightness between these 2 images here, I did crank up the ISO for this shot, just to be able to really show the difference, or be able to show the effects of the vignetting that we see along the edges and corners. So, a lot of the times I get asked this question, what settings should I use? And that is an impossible question to answer because it depends on way too many things. So instead, I launched a discussion about what your image should look like. And with DSLR cameras, all of them have a built-in function, way to view what is known as the histogram. Typically, you take an image, and then as you review it, you can pull up the histogram for that image. And the histogram is what tells you, essentially, what settings to use, what settings are needed for this particular shot. So first of all, why don't I tell people what settings I use, or actually I do quite a bit, but all the examples here tonight will show you my exact settings. But the settings will differ based on your camera. What type of sensor you're using in the camera, what lens you're using, where you're imaging from, what are the night sky conditions of that night. Is it partly cloudy? Is it fully clear? Are you shooting 10 miles away from a town? Are you shooting 20 miles deep into the mountains? All of this will change how or what settings you essentially need to use. So we turn to our histogram to tell us what is needed. So the histogram is read basically as a chart from left to right. You can see here basically a mountain structure here. What this essentially means is if we take a look at a point here, the height of the mountain is essentially the number of pixels that have a certain numerical value. So pixels can typically vary in value between 0 and 255. That discussion is for a later time, but essentially we can think about them varying from 0 to 255. A pixel with the value of 0 is what's known as being at the black point. This is the blackest, darkest pixel that you could ever have. This essentially means that no light was captured by that individual pixel. On the other hand, on the right side, we have what's known as the white point. This means that a single pixel has been filled up with photons completely, and you cannot get any type of whiter pixel than that. And basically, we have a scale in between here, and we can read the histogram as how many pixels do we have at a certain numerical value. So the more pixels, the more the mountain is over here on the left-hand side, the darker we'll have, the darker the pixels will be. Here on the right-hand side, the lighter the pixels will be. And when we're shooting nighttime images, we're wanting basically this mountain of the histogram to be between about a third and a halfway from the left-hand side. This will mean that we're not what's known as clipping any of our pixels. Clipping occurs when we're shooting and have pixels either at the black point or the white point. Essentially, when we have pixels with black point and white point, we either don't have enough data to work with, or we have too much data. We're losing information, and we want to preserve as much information as possible. So, we're going to take, and we're going to, oh yes?
Is this one little strip across your picture, or is it a whole picture?
So this is a chart within itself. So it doesn't overlay on the picture, but it represents every pixel that's in your image here. So for instance here, if on the y-axis here, let's say that this arrow here represents 50 pixels, then we can see that the pixels with a numerical value that are somewhere in this region here, there are 50 pixels that have that darkness.
Okay, I have about maybe 5,000 or 50,000 pixels.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So basically there are a couple different ways you can view a histogram on the back of your camera. One is by luminosity values, and then the other is RVD values. So basically on at least Canon, and Nikon, and Sony cameras, when you view the histogram, you can press the info button again, and it'll basically change between exposures and RGB histogram values. So in the RGB histograms, you're only looking at the red components or the red pixels, the red photo sites. Green and blue are similar. When we're talking about the luminosity values, there's basically just a simple multiplication factor that will transform the 3 RGB channels into a luminosity value. And that's the way not only cameras, but any type of photo editing software will do it as well. So Photoshop, Lightroom, most of the time they'll give you the luminosity, and then if you ask for more information, they'll break it down into 3 color channels. So this is our goal, to get basically to avoid clipping and to get the amount of the histogram between about a third and halfway through it. And to do that, we're going to use the three settings that we talked about before. We're going to use the exposure time, we're going to use the F ratio, and we're going to use the ISO. And how we work with these depends on basically the conditions that we're shooting in. And this is always going to be a sacrifice game when we're talking about nighttime photography. Unlike daytime photography or studio photography, we don't have control over the light. We have to use whatever light is out there available to us. So that means we're going to likely be using a much higher ISO than daytime photography. We're going to be using shutter speeds that are seconds, if not minutes long, in order to be able to capture enough photons. And we're going to push our lens as far as it will go in order to be able to collect as much light as possible while still trying to minimize the effects of vignetting and chromatic aberration to get those nice pinpoint stars. So, how do we get started? Now we can actually start to take some images here. So one of the first things that I recommend anyone doing is finding a particular camera lens combo that they want to use, a nice wide-angle lens, and then to go out and figure out how long of a shot can I take. And to do that, it's simply putting your camera on a tripod and shooting one shot in each of the cardinal directions. Basically, as we get close, as we're shooting north, we're shooting towards the North Celestial Pole. Stars appear to move at a much slower rate than they do when we're shooting south or near the equator. So by taking basically sample shots, one looking east, one looking west, one north and south, we can go back and look at individual images to see how much star trailing is present in these shots. So take a series of exposures pointing north, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds, and see what your comfort level of star trails is. Now I can tell you exactly how long you can take because it will depend on the sensor and the camera that you're using. It will depend on the lens that you're using. It will depend on everything else. There is a nice general rule of thumb that your exposure time should be about 500 divided by the focal length of your lens. So in this case here, I'm using a 24mm lens. I would take 500 and divide it by 24 and get something that's roughly 20 seconds. I don't know what that actually works out to be. But yeah, this is a good starting point, but actually doing the tests for your particular camera sensor combination is the best thing for you. And here we introduced a new piece of equipment as well. It's a fairly inexpensive piece of equipment called a shutter control cable or an intervalometer. Basically, this is a device that will plug into your camera to allow you to control the length of a shot. So most DSLR cameras have a limit of about 30 seconds that you can program a shot for. With an intervalometer shutter control cable, you can go a lot longer. You also have the advantage that when you press the shutter button on here, you're not actually touching the camera. If we're taking a 30-second long exposure of the sky, and we're pressing the button on the camera, no matter how careful we are, we're still going to introduce camera shake. And that will, distort our images. So, keeping our hands off of the camera, we can accomplish with an intervalometer. Of course, sometimes we want star trails, not often, but we can take, nice fancy shots by exposing for long periods of time. So let's start out shooting with moonlight. So shooting with moonlight is going to be the easiest way to get your first nightscape image. Example on the left is shot with moonlight. Example on the right is without moonlight. Now with the moon, we can see a lot more detail, a lot more interesting foregrounds. We have nice shadows and highlights in our foregrounds, but it does wash out a little bit of the night sky. Whereas on the right-hand side with no moonlight, we struggle to see the mountains, the details in the mountains, but the Milky Way does pick out a lot better. But shooting with the moonlight is going to be a lot easier because we have a lot of light to work with, which means our exposure time will be a lot less, which means we don't have to worry about star trails nearly as much. Also do a few fun things during the daytime. However, at night, shooting into the moonlight is not like shooting the moon in the day. day, shooting into the moon at night is very, very difficult. So if you take a look here, you know, this is the moon, and actually what we're seeing here is a lot of clouds being illuminated by the moon in front. So the actual size of the moon is comparable to the size of the moon that we saw before, you know, when we were focusing. It is basically a less than the size of this pointer right in the center. So it is very difficult to shoot towards the moon at night. However, we can shoot away from the moon and get wonderful images, especially if we're trying to illuminate the foreground here. So how do we use the moon to our advantage? Well, we use it sort of like we use the sun. When we go out to shoot landscape images during the day, the best times to shoot are, you know, in the golden hour, right after the sun comes up in the morning or right after the sun comes down at night. Same thing with the moon. You know, when we're going to use moonlight, if it's low on the horizon, we get all these nice shadows within the foreground. We can get a very interesting foreground, and also the moonlight has to come through a lot of the atmosphere, which means the moonlight is dimmed when it's along the horizon, which means that the stars can pop out a little bit more. We can get more detail within the Milky Way. If we don't want to shoot with the moon, we can shoot without moonlight and produce images like this. Shooting without moonlight is going to be a lot more difficult as we need longer exposure times to capture the foreground, to capture the detail of the landscape here. And as we're shooting longer exposures, we're of course starting to introduce star trails. The easiest way to shoot without moonlight is, you know, during astronomical twilight, a period when the sun is below 12 to 18 degrees below the horizon, so about an hour after sunset or an hour before sunrise. This will mean that, you know, at this time we can still get short enough exposures not to introduce a lot of star trails. And if we time it right, we can actually get the best of both worlds here. So this particular image was shot with a lot of planning in mind. So basically what I did here was I captured the night sky before the moon rose and did basically captured a panoramic of the night sky. And then I timed it out so as soon as the last exposure for the night sky finished, the moon started to rise. And we can see the effects of the moon rising over here with a little bit of light just dancing across these mountaintops, providing more detail in the landscape, as well as preserving the Milky Way and other atmospheric effects. Yes?
Was the moon behind you, or where was it?
So the moon was actually probably about here in this image. So if I were just to go a little bit further out, it'd be over and through here. So the light was coming in at, you know, basically this angle here.
Okay. Is this on Trail Ridge?
This is, yes, Trail Ridge Road. Yep.
So you can just go up here in the middle of the night?
Yes, yes. In fact, Rocky Mountain National Park is a fantastic place for nightscape photography.
Light pollution from the front range?
Oh, we do. In fact, this is the Denver Nebula right here. But with nightscape, we don't need as dark night skies as as these guys do. A little bit of light pollution can help illuminate the foreground, and even if we do have a little bit of light pollution in, we're shooting with a wide enough angle, so we're still capturing away from the light pollution. Yes?
If you drive over Trail Ridge at night, watch out for herds of elk on the road.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes, I have had quite a few close encounters on Ridge Road. Yes?
Just a quick question. You're shooting portrait. Shooting on the side across. How many frames is that?
So in this particular shot, I'm believing it was 14 across. So
Just getting that much overlap.
you just get that much overlap. Yep.
And then you just get together later?
Exactly. Yep. In fact, we'll quickly go through that in just a few moments. So another example of Mesa Arch and Canyonlands. So Shooting without moonlight, very, very difficult. You know, here, shooting with a very high ISO, if you're to look at this image on my website or up close somewhere, you can see a lot of noise that is in this image, just to be able to pull out anything in the landscape. But I did this in order to limit the shot to 30 seconds, so the stars are fairly pinpoint. So, we have a lot of limitations with just a still tripod. So, how do we overcome them? The first technique I used is, as you just saw, panoramics. So basically, if we take long exposures, we're going to start to get star trails. So this is a 30-second exposure with a 24mm lens. If I blow up this region, as I did, you can see horrible star trails that I'm not comfortable with in a finite image. Even at this resolution here, you can still notice a little bit of effects. The stars look a little bit bright and bloated, bright, and it just not working. So, how do we overcome this? Well, we take a lot of images. A lot of images that are really close to each other. Basically, we we create a panoramic. And basically what this will do, the amount of star trailing doesn't change, but the amount of star trailing that we're looking at a particular resolution does. So if we're looking at this image over here, how did that happen? There we go. Thought my laser clicked the slide. So if we look over here, this amount of star trailing is still present in all of the shots of my panoramic. But when we're looking at, say, 8x10 print, or just use 8x10 as an example here, we can see a little bit of star trailing. If we look at an 8x10 of this, we're not able to see it. We're essentially looking at it much further away. So by taking and doing the panoramic images, taking basically a frame here, a frame here, a frame here, so on and so forth, all the way down, we can hide the effects of star trails. This is a very simple technique to do, and can be done with just a still tripod and a camera and camera lens.
So you're taking 30-second exposures across the sky, so the sky is rotating.
Yes. The sky is rotating between images, yes. Thing is, if I have an example, come on. There we go. So if we overlap our images enough and take them in quick succession of each other, when we go to stitch the images together, we don't notice the effects. So basically, it's a 30-second shot here, and then as soon as that shot is done, I'm moving and capturing 30 seconds over here and 30 seconds over here. And yes, it is not a true picture, a document of the night sky at one point in time, because over here it'll be 9:30, and over here it'll be 9:40. But that difference of 10 minutes when we're talking about that much of a distance doesn't matter, and it actually doesn't even affect our stitching algorithms.
You're overlapping 50%, 100%?
So I found that so for daytime images, most software, if you read the documentation, requires about a 40% overlap. At night, I find that completely unacceptable. At nighttime, I'm shooting for 70 to 80% overlap. One of the primary reasons was just pointed out, the stars do move. By getting a lot more overlap, there's a lot more alignment points that the software is able to trigger. So we're able to take and get a better fit of an image, even with moving stars.
Are you moving it manually, or do you have a motor?
I'm moving it manually. So basically, I have a ball head up here, and I have one of my axes will just allow me to rotate my camera along one axis. So I'm just rotating it all by hand. Most ball heads come with markers that will tell you, degrees and angles. I don't even bother with that. I just know what my field of view is, and I go, that looks good, and oh, that looks good, that looks good. Okay, I'm tired of this. Let's really go here. So, one helpful tool yeah. That was recently introduced, very recently, about 2 years ago or so, in Photoshop and Lightroom. When you go to create a panoramic, most of the time your initial panoramic will look like what's on the left-hand side here. The edges of your frame will be highly distorted in order to get everything to align. However, they have introduced what's known as boundary warp, and it's just a single slider that you move across, and it will give you a nice rectangular image, making panoramics a lot easier to stitch and put together.
Does that distort the edges of the picture a lot, though?
Actually, I find that it sort of balances it out. So if we're talking about an image over here, these stars here are highly distorted because it's basically saying, okay, I don't need to align anything more to the left-hand side here, so I can really stretch out this left-hand side in order to make the right-hand side connect better. But by using boundary warp, I find that it basically takes this curve and just squishes it back, and I see really nice pinpoint stars in a boundary warp processed image. A lot better than I would expect it to be, anyway. And then the outcome of that particular image. Oh, here's the outcome of that particular image, I should say. So, 14 millimeter lens. Basically, the big takeaway here is panoramic images will allow you to take longer exposures without being able to see the effects of star trail and allow you to push images more. Yes?
On the left side, just before that, was that like sort of shadow of yourself right there?
Yes, it was. Yes. So this was shot with the moonlight. You can see the moon was pretty much directly behind me. I did not notice that I was in the picture when I was taking the exposures. So I caught that. So basically, to go from here to here in Photoshop, I just did what's known as content-aware fill. Basically, what content-aware fill does is it will you mask off an area. So basically, you mask off this region here, and then their algorithm will take nearby pixels and try and treat the area that you selected as a gap. It'll basically delete what you selected here, and it'll take all these surrounding pixels and try and come up with brand new content that should approximate what was in the gap that you selected. So it is a fairly sophisticated machine learning technique that's becoming popular and was introduced into the Photoshop library 4 or 5 years ago now. Yes?
In this example, how many images?
This example here, we're talking 11 images, 30 seconds long, from one side to the other, with a 14 millimeter lens.
Why does it look like the Milky Way is an arch like that?
Because the Milky Way is an arch like this. So this was, so direction-wise, we're looking over here is in the southeast, up here is the northeast to north. And basically, this was taken fairly early on in the season. So basically, as the Milky Way was rising, we can see the Milky Way arching along the eastern horizon. We waited a few more hours, the Milky Way would be more vertical and coming out of the south. Yes, these are all clouds that are creeped in during my image. Yes?
Is there any advantage to using a narrower angle lens for a panorama like
For a panoramic like this, no, because I was specifically trying to capture the Milky Way. So going with a long focal length lens would have meant that I would have not only to take a panoramic like this, but a multi-row panoramic as well, and that becomes a lot more difficult. However, there are situations where a longer focal length lens can be useful. I have a couple examples later on, but especially when we're talking under moonlit skies, trying to get some landscape that's far in the distance. I have easily used 85 millimeter on a regular basis, sometimes going up to 200 or 400 millimeters as well. Most of the time, though, I'm doing stuff with wide-angle lenses.
What about using fisheye?
Fisheye, for panoramics, not so much. I find that the distortion with fisheye is too great to overcome. Fisheye does give you a nice, one and done type of shot, though. And there are, within Lightroom, there are ways to do lens corrections to try and negate some of that fisheye effect. That said, there's only 1 or 2 types of shots that I would ever attempt with a fisheye. And basically those type of shots are trying to get a 180 fisheye, so I have the landscape all the way around, and then I'm shooting the entire night sky in a single frame. Outside of that, I've tried other fisheyes in the past, and I just have not had success with them for nightscapes. So, the other main technique that I want to talk about is high dynamic range photography. So, here is the problem. We take and we expose an image that is right for the night sky. We have nice pinpoint stars, and you can see this beautiful canyon down below, except you can't. So we have no detail in the landscape here. We want to take this shot though. We have a nice night sky, we have some city in the background, we want this shot. So how do we get it? Well, this is a 20-second shot, so let's take a longer exposure to see what happens. Now we can see that we have a nice canyon down below. This is Black Canyon, the Gunnison. Thank you. So this took me 360 seconds to take this shot in order to get a very, very small amount of detail in the landscape here. And I should mention that this is a not processed image, so this is pretty much straight out of the camera. But when I'm looking at the night sky, we have beyond horrible star trails. I didn't even need to really blow this up for you to be able to see the amount of star trails in the night sky. So how do we get this final image? Well, we get it by combining exposures. We take the exposure for the night sky and we combine it with the exposure for the landscape here. And basically, for nightscape photography, especially in this state, in Utah, and in all these mountain states with low light pollution, not including the front range here, I find that this is pretty much a necessary technique. This is, landscapes are very, very dark. The night sky comes out fairly quickly. So by taking and combining the night sky, an exposure for the night sky with an exposure for the landscape, we can get a more realistic picture of what is actually there. Yes? Stitch them together through Photoshop and Lightroom, so mostly Photoshop. I have an example a little bit later on, but essentially what I do is I take the landscape shot and I remove the night sky from it, and then I take the image of the night sky and just basically put it right underneath the image of the landscape with the sky cut out. So my personal philosophy is I only do that on images that I take at the same time, at the same location with the same equipment. So I don't overlay an image of the night sky taken from the desert in Arizona and overlay it over the Denver skyline and say, hey, look at the Milky Way, it's bright over the city. I personally take images taken at the same time, same location, same setup. So here's a 20-second image of the sky, 360-second of the landscape, taken a minute apart and processed together. Another example here. Here we have a view of Lightroom. We can see a histogram in the corner. Again, this exposure here is for the night sky. We can see it on the histogram because the landscape is being clipped. It is on that left-hand side. However, our night sky is nice and within that 1/3 region from the left. We take that and blow up the histogram a little. We take another shot for the landscape. This one is properly exposed to the landscape. We can see the effects of the night sky in the right. The landscape is the mountain on the left. And we take these images and combine them together.
How do you do that when there's a lot of trees?
So that involves a lot of careful masking. And there is a tool called Luminosity, or a technique known as Luminosity Masks. Invented 10, 15 years ago, only recently been starting to use in photography worlds because it's now a lot easier to use, but essentially luminosity masks will automatically pick out the parts of the image that are of a certain luminosity value. So if we have a lot of trees in our image that are right up against the night sky, the trees will typically be darker than the night sky, or vice versa. And the luminosity masks can really pick that out and be able to easily mask your image. Yes?
Well, it's pretty easy to see the separation of the histogram. Is there a tool that allows you to remove the bright pixels in this histogram and the dark pixels in the other one?
So for this example here, the tool that I just talked about, Luminosity Masks, it is a great tool for doing that. Basically, for the luminosity masks, you would be able to choose for this what's known as highlights. You use an aggressive highlights, and it would basically grab everything out that's over here. Now, the advantage of using luminosity masks instead of other techniques that can do that is a luminosity mask changes how much it will mask out. And basically, as we get further along to the left here, if we're trying to get the highlights out, as we move further along to the left, it will gradually start to decrease. So we'll get 100% of everything that's right here selected. We'll get 75% of everything that's right here. We'll get 50% of everything right here, and 10% of everything right here. So it produces a much more natural masking element than just going in and brute force selecting these pixels here.
Is that Telluride?
Yes, Telluride. I believe this is Last Dollar Ranch, so near Divide, Colorado. Good eye.
I just saw the road when we were up there, and I thought, I wonder where that goes, and now I know.
So, briefly talk, we can combine these two, high dynamic range panoramic, to do the same thing. We can take exposures for the landscape, we can take exposures for the night sky as a pano, and we can combine them as well. So this one is an exposure for the night sky, this is an exposure for the foreground, and here's the completed image. Couple other last things to help improve the ability to do nightscape images, camera modifications. So I do not use a stock camera. A stock camera is basically a camera that comes directly from Best Buy or wherever you buy your cameras these days. Cameras are designed to approximate human vision. So even though they can capture a much broader range of light. So there is basically a filter that sits right in front of the sensor that will reject certain amounts of certain types of light to give you an image that looks like the scene that you're trying to shoot at. For nighttime imaging, this is horrible because it rejects light and we are desperate for light. So we can have basically the internal filter of the camera replaced with a UVIR filter, and to get about an extra 2 full stops of light. So the equivalent of 4 times more light can be collected by having a camera modified. Unfortunately, it produces a little bit of a different colors. If you can see, basically, that the graph here, the blue line is the stock filter, the black line is the replacement filter, and we're getting a lot more light in the red part of the spectrum of the 600 to 650 nanometer wavelengths of light. So it produces images that are a lot more red. However, we can take and we can basically, with just minor processing, we can take and still use our cameras for daytime imaging. It just requires a custom white balance and a custom tint setting within our camera. A couple different resources for getting your camera modified. Once a camera is modified, it cannot be unmodified. I personally use Hap Griffin at Imaging Infinity to modify my camera, but there are a couple different companies out there, and in fact, Hugh-Tech will sell you a brand new camera instead of having to send your camera in to get it modified. So just another tool to upgrade for nightscape images. And basically this is the effect. So this is taken with a stock camera. We can see this is a 120-second image. The settings will be the same between these two. The Milky Way is fairly faint. It's fairly washed out. It's not a properly exposed image. It's a little bit dimmer. Same shot taken with a modified camera. We can see it's a lot brighter, a lot more detail within the Milky Way, a lot more in the hydrogen alpha part of the spectrum, and it's basically getting a modified camera on the night sky is a huge, huge benefit to be able to capture as many photons as possible. We can also add tracking devices. So what I have up here is a tracking device. This will allow me to counteract the rotation of the Earth. Why do we want this? Sometimes our images look unimpressive. The night sky is unimpressive when we're limited to a 30-second exposure or 20-second exposure, or however long we're limited to before getting star trails. So this particular shot is a panoramic image, about 8 seconds per shot, 5 shots up and down. And the Milky Way, it does not really stand out. It is not bright. It is not impressive, at least in my opinion. But if I take and instead of shooting the night sky just with a 8-second image on a still tripod, if I put it and take a much longer shot while it's being tracked, we can get a lot more detail within the Milky Way. We can get a lot more stars popping out. And so the shots for the night sky here were 300 seconds in length. And even with 300-second shots, there are no star trails in this image. So we can go a lot deeper. We can push the data a lot more. Yes?
How did the structure there is, how did that not move with the tracker?
It did move with the tracker. So essentially what I did here was I took 4 shots for the night sky as a panoramic, 300 seconds a shot, and then it is immediately after the sky shots finished, I just pulled the power cable on my tracker and it became a still tripod. And then I continued the panoramic going down to capture the rest of Devil's Tower. So this is the way to get the long exposures for the night sky and still get whatever exposures are needed for the landscape. So the device I use is known as the Astro. It's up here if you want to take a look at it afterwards. I was informed about 45 minutes ago that this device has been discontinued. However, there are similar other devices, very lightweight, very portable tracking devices. Basically, I can have this out of my car and set up and be using it within a minute. Other devices can accomplish the same thing. Skywatcher makes one called the Star Adventurer. The Kinko makes Sky Nemo. Vixen makes Polaris Star Tracker. They all operate the same way. They're designed for basically a camera and a lens that will track, counteract the rotation of the Earth for a limited amount of time. So this device here will track for up to 2 hours. I personally know that the Skywatcher will go all night. I don't know about, I think the Vixen has a 1-hour time limit on it.
And they just have a fixed arm and then a motor to move some other scale arm?
Exactly. So if you can come up here and take a look at this, basically I have 2 arms here. These arms separate along a big screw that is within the motorized component of this, and it will track for 2 hours as it moves along that screw. So we can do a lot more when we're tracking. We can take and as we're getting rid of our limitation on exposure time, that means we can change our F ratio. It means we can change our ISO. We can lower the ISO, which means we have less noise in the image. We can increase the F ratio, which means we have less vignetting, less better looking stars essentially. And as a bonus, we can also start to get into deep sky astrophotography with this type of setup. Just basically a camera lens on a tracking device. So, just a few concluding examples, basically pretty pictures to look at. This is, this was one of the title slides here, an HDR shot, a shot for the landscape, another shot tracked on the night sky, and a third shot for the reflection on the lake. Taken in Utah. I believe this is one of the windows or turrets or window turrets. I forget what they call it at the moment. Another example of a nightscape taken at Colorado's man-made ice castles. A horizon-to-horizon shot of the Milky Way is a panoramic. So basically the horizon, one direction is over here, this is over here, this is south, going all the way up to north. The moon rising over the city of Fort Collins. This is one of my few examples. This was taken with a 200 millimeter lens and a 2x telephoto or teleextender, so essentially a 400 millimeter lens, taking the pano in the same way. This is why the moon is so large in this image. Another shot of arches, turrets, windows. I really don't know what they call these anymore. It's one of the more famous or popular tourist sites. Monument Valley, did a nighttime tour of Monument Valley. This is the totem pole feature in the southeast part of the park. Another example of a long focal length astrophotography. This is taken with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens at I believe 200 millimeters. I could be wrong about that, but very short exposures, 8 seconds for the night sky in order to avoid a lot of star trails, 40 seconds for the landscape in order to get the nice views from Monument Valley. Another shot from Trail Ridge Road. We have a little bit of aurora in the background here, as well as the International Space Station flying over this panoramic image. Mesa Arch at Canyonlands National Park during the Perseid meteor shower. Able to see a little the northern part of the Milky Way, a few Perseid meteors, as well as the I forget what it's called now. Zodiacal lights. Thank you. Zodiacal lights coming out at a diagonal over here. So that is it for me.
Any questions?
Yes.
You flipped through how you processed that beautiful lake with the ridge in the back.
Yes.
Can you go a little slower for us?
Sure.
Show how you stitch all that parts together.
Yeah.
Because that is fast.
Doing that a little bit for time. Okay, so this was my tracked shot for the night sky. So this was on the tracking device. Basically, we have nice pinpoint stars, even though this is a 200 and 300 second exposure. Since it is on the tracking device, we see that the landscape is horribly blurred. We are taking this image here and essentially removing the landscape. So we're only left with the night sky here.
Did you have to draw that line in and say, everything below this, zero out?
So I started off with Luminosity Masks in order to get most of it. Basically, it auto-masked a lot of this, and then I just went back and did a manual blur to get a little bit more of the edges out, and basically to define the region that I'm going to push the landscape up onto. So as we see in this next shot here, the landscape will start, basically right about here. This is the top of the line that I indicated of where I'm going to basically just move up the landscape a little bit to remove the effects of the blurriness from over here, so of the mountain moving. So this is my exposure for the landscape here. Nice pinpoint detail, nice and sharp. Everything is properly exposed. Nothing is clipping here. So I'm taking this and then overlaying it with the image of the night sky. And again, right now, both of these are straight out of the camera, so no processing has been done. Then I'm going to take and just add one more exposure in for the lake here. Wanted to take and get about a 30-second exposure to the lake to get this nice reflection without overblowing the lake. And then once I get these three images in place, then I just go in and do the final stages of processing, adjusting color balance, contrast, adding a little bit here and there. But yeah.
What's your favorite lens?
Favorite lens? Sigma 24 millimeter. I also quite often use the Sigma 35 millimeter. The 24 millimeters and f1.4, I actually think they're both f1.4. Basically, these are prime lenses. Typically, prime lenses allow you to open up the lens a lot more to these lower f ratios, f1.4, f2. So when I'm shooting, I can shoot at f2, f4 without having huge amounts of vignetting, without having lots of huge amounts of chromatic aberration. So by starting off with a lens that opens real wide, I'm able to stop it down without losing too much information. Those are my favorite lenses for nighttime, or for Nightscape, because they're wide enough. The 24 millimeter, a lot of the shots that you saw tonight were with 24 millimeter, using to get the Milky Way in its arch. When I want to get a little bit more detail, when I want to get a little bit more bang for the buck, especially in for instance, the shot for the Devil's Tower, somewhere in through here, I turn to a 35 millimeter lens. This allows me to basically make the Milky Way a more central and more prominent feature within the image. So between those two lenses, that comprises 80% of all my shots. And if you don't want to spend the money for the Sigma versions, there's another brand called Rokinon that makes basically the same lenses. Excellent quality. The only difference is there is no automatic focus on those lenses from Rokinon. Everything on Rokinon lenses is all manual, which for nighttime photography, that's fine because we're doing everything manually anyway. So, and the Rokinon will set you back quite a few hundred less than the Sigma versions, or the Canon or the Nikon versions of the same lens. So.
How long did you have to wait for that? The Galaxy shot, Andromeda Galaxy shot.
Oh, at the ice phase. So I had a 40, somewhere between a 45 and a 50-second window of when the Andromeda Galaxy would be right in that hole. So I waited, I basically that was looking directly up, so I was lying on my back waiting for that shot for about 45 minutes, just for that one alignment. Got one shot out of it, and at least one shot for the sky portion out of it, and took a few more for the ice castles, since I had to do a HDR technique on that, since the ice castles were a lot brighter than the Andromeda Galaxy. But yeah, that was about an hour long to get that shot of, essentially 30 seconds worth of data.
And not on the planning calendar, no one was going to be over there.
Exactly. Yep. And that was really an ad hoc type of thing. That was the first time I visited the ice castles. I got permission to be there after the public left. After it got dark, they left the lights on for me. And once I saw that, I just used Starry Night on my iPhone to see what alignments were available, where the Milky Way was, and I just happened to notice that that alignment would be possible. So.
Where next?
Where next? Yeah, just recently did a trip to Glacier. Hoping to get out to Yellowstone. During
Sand dunes.
I've done sand dunes quite a bit, and in fact, that's only about 2.5 hours for me. So I'm waiting for a huge blanket of snow to cover the dunes before going back there. So
So you did a panoramic of the sky, and you did a panoramic of the landscape too?
correct, yes. So this was 4 images for the sky and 3 images for the landscape. Yes.
You've had a bit of practice at this now.
A little bit.
But using your more complicated image of that cliff and the lake down below, how long are you sitting in your chair processing that image?
Processing wise?
Well, we'll work it out.
Yeah. So I would say that this is one of my most complicated images, and I would say that this took me maybe 5 or 6 hours to process over the course of 2 weeks. So a lot of times when I process images, I will do the bulk of processing all on the first day, and then I'll go back, 2 days later, 3 days later, do a little bit here and there until I finally get what I like. But
Time behind the camera at the site.
on site here,
More than that.
so probably got there. So I probably waited about. I think for this shot, I waited an hour for the Milky Way to be in the right position, and then from the time that I started taking my actual shots, that would be in the image. The final time I took the shot, maybe a half hour to 45 minutes. So, and that was a lot of, basically waiting for the Milky Way to get in the right position, making sure that my tracker could support a 240-second image, of basically figuring out what my exposures would be needed to get the detail in the landscape, and most importantly for this shot, there's a road that's over here that at midnight no one should be driving on, but apparently that was the interstate on the night that I tried to shoot. So I went through at least a half a dozen shots that were close to 500 seconds, waiting, trying to get it so a car's headlights wouldn't shine out over here.
So I noticed it was summertime too, so it had to have been a little bit warmer than it could have been.
Right.
Yes. So only a few pockets of snow left over, so it was fairly warm that evening.
Yeah, do you run into more wildlife?
Surprisingly, not nearly as much wildlife as I would think I should. I ran in, I got way too close to a bear one time in Rocky Mountain. I just went around a tight corner and there was a bear.
You were in your car.
I was on the trail that time, so that was. But a lot of times, the animals I encounter are things like bats, and when I'm dealing with lakes, small critters that hop along lakes.
Yeah.
Very few actual animal encounters at night, with the exception of that terrifying bear. Yeah. He's a lunatic. I don't want to be with him. Other questions?
And can you leave the one with your contact info out there so I can?
Sure.
Thank you very much.
And also, we have a lot of lights out at the football field, and the game is still going on.